The lawyer told Ruth Tolliver that the tin building on the dead rail spur was worth about $1,100, and only if somebody came out and stripped the roof for the metal. He was not being unkind. He had run the numbers twice, and the numbers said what they said. He was also completely right and completely wrong in the way that men with good numbers often are, because the thing inside that building had never been worth a single dollar to anyone. Nobody had ever bought it. Nobody had ever sold it. It had no market, no auction record, no price per pound. It had survived 91 years for exactly that reason, and within 9 months it would be the most valuable object in Cadmus County, and the reason would have almost nothing to do with money. But that is the end of it. The beginning is a Thursday in March, in an office above the pharmacy in Ordway, with the radiator knocking and 4 people at a table meant for 6. Lowell Kinnard had been the Tolliver family lawyer for 31 years, which meant he was now obliged to read aloud a partnership agreement he had drawn himself. He read it slowly. He did not look up much. The substance of it was simple enough that Ruth understood it before he was halfway through, and she sat very still while he finished, because she had been raised not to interrupt a man doing his job. Harlan Tolliver, her husband of 54 years, had died on the 19th of February at 81 in the front room, with the television on and a cup of tea going cold on the sill. His will left everything he owned to her. That part was 1 sentence long, and there was no fighting it. The trouble was the word owned. The home quarter did not belong to Harlan. It belonged to Tolliver Brothers Farms, a partnership formed in 1963 between Harlan and his older brother Wendell. The house Ruth had lived in since she was 22 stood on partnership ground and had been carried on the partnership books as an asset since before the moon landing. The machinery was partnership. The bins were partnership. The pickup in the drive was partnership. On the death of a partner, Kinnard read, the surviving partner shall have the option to purchase the decedent's interest at book value as carried on the most recent schedule. Book value. Not what the ground was worth in a county where good black dirt had tripled in a decade. Book value meant what the partnership had paid in 1963 and 1971 and 1979, less depreciation, on paper, in a ledger nobody had opened in years. Wendell exercised the option in the second week of March. He was 79 and did not come to the meeting. His son Dale came instead, in a clean quilted vest, carrying a folder he did not need. The figure Kinnard slid across the table was $61,400, and it represented a lifetime. Ruth looked at it for a long moment. Then she asked, quietly, whether she was to understand that the house was no longer hers. Kinnard said that she had 60 days. Dale said that nobody was throwing anybody out, and that everyone was upset, and that this was simply how the paper read, and that Uncle Harlan should have fixed it 30 years ago and never got around to it, and wasn't that just like him? Charmaine, Dale's wife, who had come along and had not been asked, observed that at least Ruth was getting something out of it. That was the seed house. It was the one piece of real property Harlan had ever held in his own name alone. He had bought it in 1971 out of the estate of a man named Corliss Speck for $1 and other good and valuable consideration, and he had never put it into the partnership, and Wendell had never wanted it in the partnership. It was 2 1/5 acres of railroad cinders, a cracked concrete apron, and a 3-story seed cleaning plant sided in corrugated tin, standing at the end of a spur of track that had not carried a car since 1988. Dale had a laugh about it. He said the county would probably charge her to haul it off. He said if she could find a scrapper willing to climb it, she might clear enough for a used car. He said all of this in a friendly voice, with his hand flat on his folder, and Charmaine laughed with him, and Kinnard studied the middle distance the way lawyers learn to. Ruth said thank you, and signed where she was told to sign. Afterward, she could not remember going down the stairs. She called her daughter that night from the kitchen phone, standing up, because sitting down made it harder to sound steady. Nadine was a nurse in a city 1,100 miles west, with 2 children and a mortgage and a night shift starting in 40 minutes. She said all the right things and offered the spare room. Ruth said she would think about it, and both of them understood she would not. Then, Ruth hung up and stood in her own kitchen, in a house that had stopped being hers on a Thursday afternoon, and looked at the jar of pencils on the windowsill that Harlan had kept sharpened for 50 years, and that she had never once asked him about. On the ring the lawyer had handed her there were 11 keys. She had used 4 of them in her life. The other 7 had ridden on Harlan's belt every day since 1971, and she had never thought to ask what they opened, because a woman does not interrogate her husband about his keys, and because she had assumed, the way a person assumes the sun, that there would be time. She moved into the seed house in the last week of April, because 60 days is 60 days, and because the arithmetic of rent in Ordway did not work out against $61,000 that had to last however long she had left. The building sat where the town gave out. Beyond it there was a fence line, a drainage ditch, and then a section of black ground running flat to the horizon, with nothing on it but a pivot and the sky. The spur track came in from the north and simply stopped, the rails going to rust under a mat of brome, the last 20 feet of them buried where the county had graded a field entrance across them. Up close, the seed house was bigger than anyone in town seemed to remember it being. 3 floors of tin over a heavy timber frame, a squared elevator leg running up the north wall like a spine, a truck bay on the roadside, and on the rail side a wide loading door hung on a rusted overhead track, chained shut and padlocked. Somebody long ago had painted the whole thing a green that had gone the color of pond water. 2 of the upper windows were boarded. The rest had been painted over from the inside, so that the glass looked like nothing at all. Ruth stood on the cinders that first afternoon, with the ring of keys in her fist, and thought, distinctly and without self-pity, that she had come down in the world about as far as a person can come. Then she went in and started sweeping, because that is what she knew how to do. The main floor took her 9 days. Chaff lay over everything in a soft gray felt an inch thick, and when she disturbed it, it went up in a column that hung in the light from the door and came down for an hour afterward. It got into her collar and into her tea. It smelled like a granary and like linseed oil and, faintly and everywhere, like mice. The machines came out of it one at a time as she worked, the way a room comes out of a fog. 2 fanning mills the size of upright pianos, their hoppers hand-lettered in a script nobody had used since the war. A gravity table on cast iron legs. An indent cylinder, a long brass drum drilled with thousands of tiny pockets, that she could turn with one hand and that made a low sound like water. Belts, pulleys, a line shaft under the ceiling. Everything greased. Everything covered. Not one machine had been left to seize. That was the first thing that did not fit, and she noticed it and set it aside. The office was in the southeast corner, 12 feet by 14, with a plank counter, a coal stove, a slop sink that ran cold, and a window that faced the road. She scrubbed the window glass with vinegar and newspaper until the light came through it yellow instead of brown. She swept out 4 decades of mousework from under the counter. She washed the floor twice, and it went from gray to a warm honey oak that she had not expected, and that made her sit down on a nail keg and press the heel of her hand against her mouth for a while. She brought over what would fit in the pickup Dale had let her keep for $100. Her bed. 2 chairs. The good table. 4 boxes of dishes, the pencil jar, and the winter coat that still smelled like Harlan, because it was Harlan's. Everything else went in a sale on the lawn on a Saturday, and half the town came, and were kind to her face, and bought her things for very little. She rigged a life. A hot plate on the counter. A kettle. An extension cord run up the wall with cable staples to a bulb on a cord over the office table. The slop sink for washing. a camp toilet behind a curtain in the scale room, which she never once let herself feel ashamed of, because shame costs money, and she had none to spend. On cold mornings, she lit the coal stove with corn cobs and pallet wood, and sat with her hands around a cup, and watched the light come up over the flat ground through her clean window. She washed her clothes in the slop sink on Mondays with a bar of yellow soap and a scrub board she bought for $2 at the thrift store in the county seat, and strung a line across the scale room from a hook to a nail, and in July the building was hot enough that a shirt hung there at 8 in the morning was dry by 10. She learned which of the 3 doors would swell and stick after rain. She learned that the grain leg made a sound in a west wind like somebody walking slowly on the 3rd floor, and that it did this only in a west wind, and that after a while she stopped looking up when it did. She learned to keep the tea in a tin because of the mice, and then, once Nickel had been there a month, to keep it in the cupboard again like a normal woman. At night the tin talked. It ticked as it cooled, a long, irregular conversation running up the north wall, and once she understood it was only metal she began to sleep through it. There were barn swallows in the head house. There was a gray cat with a torn ear who came for a week before she admitted she was feeding it, and after that it slept on the foot of her bed, and she called it Nickel because it was the color of one and because she had to call it something. Otis Dray came out in the 2nd week with a casserole in a towel on the seat beside him. He was 84 and had bought grain for the elevator in town for 40 years, and he walked around the outside of the building once before he came in, which struck her as odd until much later. He did not say much. He asked whether the roof still held on the east side. He said Harlan had been a particular man, and that particular men leave things in order. He looked at the swept floor and the greased line shaft for a while. Then he said something Ruth turned over for weeks afterward, which was that half this county owed her husband and did not know it anymore, and when she asked what he meant he said it was not his to say, and took his towel back and drove off. The rest of Ordway was less careful. She heard, second-hand and third-hand, what was being said, that the Tolliver widow was living in a grain shed, that Dale had offered her a room and she was too proud, that she had lost her mind a little, which was understandable, poor thing, at her age, and so soon after. Charmaine came out once, in June, and did not get out of the car. She said, through the window, that she just wanted to check that Ruth had a working smoke detector, and that this was really not a healthy place for a woman of 76, and that Dale knew a fellow who took down buildings like this for the tin and would do it for nothing if the tin was good, and that Ruth should think about it. Ruth said she would think about it. Then she went back inside and did not cry, and swept the stair landing instead, which was the same thing done differently. It was on the 17th of June, sweeping that landing, that she noticed the door. It was at the back of the cleaning floor, in the north wall, under the elevator leg. It had been painted the same pond water green as the wall around it, frame and all, so that from the middle of the room it read as wall. It was heavy, and it was hung on strap hinges, and it had a hasp with a padlock. The padlock was the only object in that entire building that was not covered in dust. It was oiled. The shackle was bright where it moved. Somebody had been opening that lock regularly, in a building that had been empty of work for 30 years, and had gone on opening it right up until, she understood, standing there with her broom, the 19th of February. None of the 11 keys fit the padlock. She tried them twice, and then a third time in a different order, kneeling on the boards with the bulb swinging behind her, and when she was finished she sat back on her heels and laughed, once, out loud, at herself, in an empty building, which is a sound a person does not forget making. She looked for that key for 11 days. She went through the coats hanging on nails in the scale room. She went through the coffee cans on the shelf above the workbench, the tin of cotter pins, the drawer of dead flashlights. She took apart the seat of the pickup. She went out to the farm on a Sunday, when she knew Dale would be at the elevator, and asked Wendell, through the storm door, whether Harlan had left any keys at the shop. And Wendell said no, and did not open the door, and that was the last conversation she ever had with her brother-in-law. She found it on the 28th of June, at the office table, in the jar of pencils. The jar was a quart-canning jar, and it held, she counted afterward, 63 pencils, every one of them a plain yellow number 2. Every one of them sharpened, some of them worn down to 3 inches. She had carried that jar out of a kitchen that was no longer hers and set it on a plank counter, and had never emptied it, because it had never occurred to her that a jar of pencils was a thing that needed emptying. She tipped it out to wipe the dust off, and a flat brass key came out with them and rang on the table. She sat with it in her palm for a while. It was warm, the way brass gets. It was worn smooth on both faces from 50 years of somebody's thumb. The lock opened on the second try. The door was heavier than it looked, because it was not one door but 2 boards deep with a layer of tar paper between them, and behind it was not a room so much as a box that somebody had built inside the building. The walls were double-boarded and packed with sawdust. The floor was raised off the concrete on cedar sleepers and floored again in tongue and groove, so it gave slightly underfoot and stayed dry. There was no window. There was a length of stovepipe through the north wall with a screened baffle and a damper, and a thermometer and a hygrometer hung on 2 nails, and a pencil line on the doorframe with dates beside it going down the wood in a narrow column. It was 10 degrees cooler in there than in the rest of the building, and the air was so dry it caught in her throat, and it smelled like paper and cedar and, underneath, like a granary in August. Along the whole of the back wall stood 4 oak-carved catalog cabinets, 30 drawers apiece, with brass pulls and brass label frames, the kind that used to stand in the front hall of a school. Somebody had unscrewed the little printed cards from the frames and replaced them with cards written in pencil. She read the first one. It said, Cane Creek TWP Beans 1961 to 1978. She pulled the drawer. It ran out on its rollers with a sound like a long breath, and it was full, front to back, of small craft paper envelopes standing on edge. Ruth Tolliver stood in a room her husband had built and looked at more handwriting than she had ever seen in one place in her life. She took out the first envelope. It was the size of a pay envelope, soft with age, folded once at the top and closed with a brass fastener. There was maybe 4 ounces of seed in it. It shifted when she tilted it. On the face, in pencil, Walter Kloss. Home place Sec 14, Cane Creek, Navy bean. Off the West 40, 1963 dry year. He says it is his grandfather's. Cleaned 4 lb, held 1 lb, 6 Oz, germ 96. She put it back exactly where it had been and took out the one behind it, and it was another name, another farm, another year. And the one behind that. And the one behind that. She stood at that open drawer until her legs told her to stop, and then she went and got the nail keg and sat down and kept going. There were, when the counting was finally done properly, and by somebody else, 2,847 envelopes in that room. They were beans and wheat and oats and rye and barley and flax and clover and timothy and, in one drawer all by itself, garden seed. They came from 411 farms. They carried between them 1,106 names. And every envelope was written in pencil. She noticed that on the second night, and it bothered her the way a wrong note bothers you before you can name it. And then on the third night she found the answer on the inside of the cabinet door, written in the same hand as most of the envelopes, in a short column of rules like a prayer card, pencil only. Ink fades and ink runs. Graphite is a rock, and a rock does not forget. Never open a jar on a wet day. Every lot gets grown out before the 9th year or the 9th year takes it. Write the name. The seed is not the record. The name is the record. On the shelf above the cabinets stood the jars. 200 and some quart jars and half-gallon jars, wax-sealed, each with a smaller envelope inside it, and a fold of cheesecloth holding a handful of quicklime, each labeled on the glass in grease pencil. These, she worked out later, were the master lots. The drawers were the working copies. If a drawer envelope died, the jar could bring it back. And on the end wall, on a plain shelf of 2x10s, stood the books. There were 91 of them. They were ledgers, the tall, narrow kind with leather corners and marbled edges, and they were numbered on the spine in white ink, and the first was labeled 1934. She opened the one nearest her hand and found ruled columns headed in a small, careful print. Date, grower, farm and township. Kind, pounds in. Cleaned out. Germination, held for. Charge. The last column, the one headed charge, ran down the whole page, and every line in it said the same word. None. She turned pages for 2 hours. Then she went and boiled the kettle, because her hands had started to shake and she did not want to be holding a book when they did, and she stood in the doorway of that dry little room with her tea and understood, finally, what her husband had been doing for 50 years. It was not a warehouse. It was not stock. Nothing in that room had ever been for sale. Farmers had brought him seed, their own seed, the seed off their own ground, the strain their father or their grandmother had been keeping true on that particular farm for 40 or 70 or 100 years. He had run it through the fanning mill and the gravity table and the indent cylinder, cleaned it, tested it, written down what it did, given most of it back, and kept a little. And then, every year, forever, he had planted a few of those little lots out in rows behind the building, and grown them and picked them, and put fresh seed in fresh envelopes, so that a bean somebody's grandmother had carried into this county in a coffee would still wake up when you put it in the ground. Held for. That was the column that told her. Held for W. Kloss. Held for the Radleen place. Held for whoever comes. He had not owned any of it. He had been keeping it. For the first week she went in only in the mornings, because it felt like a church, and she could not shake the feeling that she ought to be let in rather than let herself in. Then she started taking the nail keg and the bulb on its long cord, and staying until her back gave out. Reading names of people she had gone to school with, people she had buried, people she had never heard of, farms that were now 3 farms or no farm at all. Some of the envelopes were written by women. Not many, and mostly in the war years, and one of them stopped her for an hour. It was dated the 9th of September 1943, and the hand was small and very upright, and it said, Hulda Brandhorst, for the Brandhorst place, Sec. 3, Cane Creek. Winter wheat, Ordway amber. I am putting in what he would put in. If he does not come home, somebody should still have it. Cleaned 9 lb, held 2 lb. There was no note about whether he came home. Ruth looked in the 1946 book and the 1947 book and found the Brandhorst place still depositing, in a different hand, a heavier one, and decided that was an answer, and closed the book before it could be a different one. And then, on a Tuesday night in the second week of July, she reached the far end of the shelf and pulled down the oldest books, and everything she thought she understood turned over. The handwriting was wrong. The first 11 ledgers, 1934 through 1944, were not in Harlan's hand. Harlan wrote in a cramped, upright print that leaned nowhere and never varied. This was different. It ran forward, and the capitals had a little hook on them, and the 7s were crossed. She knew that hand. She had a birthday card in a box under her bed written in that hand. She had a note in that hand that said back by 6, gone to the bottom, which she had kept for 55 years for no reason she could ever explain. It was her father's. Corliss Speck had started this. In 1934, at 29 years old, in a rented building on a rail spur, in the worst year anybody in Cadmus County had ever had, her father had begun writing down other people's seed and other people's names, and he had gone on doing it for 37 years. and he had never once mentioned it to his daughter. She sat down on the floor with the 1934 book open on her knees and made a sound she had not made at his funeral. Because she knew the rest of that story. Everybody in Ordway of a certain age knew the rest of that story, in the version the town told. Corliss Speck had lost the home place in 1969. He had gone under in a good year, which is the kind of failure a farming town never forgives, because it means the fault was in the man. He had refused to take the seed contract when the dealer came through, and everyone else took it. He had gone on cleaning his own beans and other people's beans in that old tin building instead of doing something sensible. The bank had called the note. The ground went at auction to a man from 2 counties over. Corliss died in the spring of 1971 in a rented house on 4th Street in Ordway, aged 66, and the general opinion, expressed gently at the lunch afterward, was that he had been a stubborn crank who had thrown away 160 acres over an idea. Ruth had been 21. She had believed it. Not all of it, and not out loud, but enough of it that when she married Harlan Tolliver the following spring she had felt, underneath the happiness, a small, shameful relief at getting a different name. She went looking for her own name then. It took her until 2 in the morning, and she found it in the book marked 1959 on a page for the 8th of September, in the middle of a run of ordinary entries about oats. Ruth, age 9, brought in the bean off the north end in a Prince Albert tin, all by herself, would not let me carry it. Cane Creek Navy, our own line. Cleaned 2L3 Oz. Germ 98, held for her. She did not remember doing it. That is the thing she could not get past, sitting on that floor at 2 in the morning with her back against a cabinet full of other people's grandmothers. She had no memory of it at all. She had been 9 years old. She had carried a tobacco tin of beans 1.5 miles up the road to her father at the seed house, and somewhere in the 67 years since, the day had simply gone out of her. But he had written it down. He had put her name in the same column as every other name, in pencil, so it would not fade. In a book he plainly intended somebody to read someday. Held for her. The last page her father ever wrote was dated the 11th of October 1970, and it was not about seed. The hand was shakier than it had been in 1934, but the sevens were still crossed. There were 2 lines. The first said, "That H." Tolliver had agreed to carry the books, and had been shown the grow-out rotation and the rule about the 9th year. The second said that Harlan was not to trouble Ruth with any of this, ever, because her father's ideas had already cost her a house and a name in this town, and she was not going to be made to carry them too. Underneath, Harlan had signed it, just his initials, in that cramped upright print, the way a man signs for a delivery. He had been 26 years old. He had not yet asked her to marry him. Ruth sat with that for 3 days. It was the hardest thing in the room, harder than the drawer with her name in it, because it meant that every evening of 54 years when Harlan had said he was going out to the seed house to check on something, he had been keeping a promise to a dead man about her, and had never once been able to tell her, and had gone on doing it alone in a dry room in the dark for half a century. She was angry for about a day and a half. Then she was not, and what came after the anger did not have a name. What it did have was a practical edge. She was 76 years old, she had $61,000 and a tin building, and there was something in her north room that she did not understand and could not evaluate, and would not live forever to protect. She needed somebody who knew what they were looking at. So she called the county extension office, because it was the only number she could think of, and asked if anyone there knew anything about old seed. Junie Barrows was 31, and had held the Cadmus County post for 2 years, and had, she admitted much later, driven out expecting to find a grieving widow with a shed full of mouse-chewed sacks and a sentimental attachment to them. She had a polite speech ready about disposal. She never gave it. She stood in the doorway of the dry room with her clipboard down at her side and did not say anything for a long time. Then she asked whether she could take photographs, and Ruth said yes, and Junie took 140 of them. And then she read the inside of the cabinet door twice. And then she went out and sat in her truck on the cinders for 20 minutes with the door open and her boots on the running board, on the phone. She came back in and said she had someone she wanted to bring out, if that was all right. She said it carefully, the way you speak when you are trying not to promise anything. Dr. Sabine Ochiltree came 11 days later in a university van with a graduate student named Theo Vong and 4 plastic coolers and a case of instruments. She was a small woman in her 50s with cropped gray hair and reading glasses on a cord, and she was the curator of the small grains and legume germplasm collection at the State University, and she had been doing that work for 22 years, and she had a manner Ruth liked immediately, which was that she asked before she touched anything, and she wrote everything down. The first thing she did was not look at the seed. She stood in the middle of the dry room with a small meter in her hand and watched the number on it settle, and then she looked at the walls and asked what the fill was. Ruth said sawdust, as far as she could tell. Ochiltree asked about the pipe through the north wall, and Ruth showed her the damper and the screened baffle. Ochiltree wrote for a while. Then she said, to nobody in particular, that this room was holding 31% relative humidity in July, in this state, with no power going to it, and that she had been in accredited facilities that could not do that without a compressor. Theo Vang sat up on the office table. The test they ran is an old one and looks like nothing. You lay 100 seeds on a wet blotter, roll it up. Stand it in a covered tray at a fixed temperature, and then on the 7th day and again on the 14th, you unroll it and count how many have put out a normal root and a normal shoot. Not how many have swollen, how many have actually gone about the business of becoming a plant. They ran 206 samples over 9 days. Ruth boiled water for them and stayed out of the way, and by the 4th day was counting radicals herself with a pair of tweezers and a pair of Harlan's reading glasses. The numbers came out like this. Across the whole collection, 71% of the lots were still alive at a commercially meaningful rate. The working envelopes in the drawers averaged 64%. The wax-sealed jars on the shelf averaged 94%. The oldest material, the untouched lots from the 1930s that had never been grown out because her father had lost the building before their turn came around, was mostly gone, and a few of them were not. There was a flax deposited in 1937 by a man named Ansgar Thule that came up at 12%, which is a poor number for a farmer and an astonishing one for a scientist, because 12% of something is not zero. On the 9th day, Ochiltree sat down at the office table across from Ruth and explained what she was actually looking at, and she did it plainly, without any of the softening people use on the elderly. She said that old seed by itself is nearly worthless. She said her office is offered old seed 4 or 5 times a year, usually after a farm sale, usually in coffee cans and mason jars out of a barn loft, and that almost all of it goes in the trash, and that this is not carelessness. It is because nobody can say where it came from. A jar of beans with no name on it is a jar of beans. You cannot use it in a breeding program, you cannot register it, you cannot publish on it, you cannot put it in the national system, because there is no way to know what you have, or where it has been or how it was kept. What makes a collection useful, she said, is the writing. Who grew it? On what ground? In what year? What it did that year? Whether it was wet or dry? Whether it was ever crossed? Whether it was ever moved. She said that in 22 years, she had never seen a private collection with more than a decade of that kind of record. Then she put her hand flat on the 1934 book and said there were 91 years of it in this room, in pencil, unbroken, with a germination figure on nearly every line, and she took off her reading glasses and did not put them back on for a minute or two. The specifics came out over the following weeks, as material went back to the university in the coolers and got planted in screening trials, and they came out slowly and cautiously, because that is how science talks. The bean was first. There was a navy bean line running through the Cane Creek drawer under a dozen different family names across 60 years, and in a greenhouse screening it sat there and did not die in soil deliberately loaded with a root rot that had been quietly costing growers in 3 states real money for a decade. It was not immune. It was tolerant, and it was tolerant in a way nothing currently in the public collection was. Then, the wheat, a soft red winter wheat that appeared in the books from 1936 forward under the name Ordway Amber, deposited by 11 different farms, and which existed nowhere. Not in the National Repository, not in the state collection, not in any catalog anyone could find. Extinct in commerce since the early 50s, and until that summer, extinct in fact. There were others, smaller, a red clover with an odd flowering habit, a hullus oat, a pole bean from the garden drawer with a name written in Low German that Della Frayne at the Historical Society traced to a family who had come through in 1878. Ruth asked once what the whole of it was worth. Ochiltree said that was the wrong question, and she would answer it anyway, which is that as material, it might be worth a great deal or nothing, depending on what the trials showed, and that as a record it was, in her professional opinion, the most complete private seed archive she was aware of in the region and probably the state. Then she said something else, and she said it looking at Ruth over the top of the glasses, which was that Ruth should not sign anything with anybody about any of it until she had a lawyer, and that she should get one soon, because collections like this one have a way of acquiring relatives. The county paper ran a piece in the second week of August. It was 400 words and a photograph of the outside of the building, and it used the phrase seed library, which was nobody's idea and which stuck. After that they came, not in a flood, in ones and twos, in the evenings, in pickups. A man of 60 from over by the county line who stood in the dry room with his cap off and asked whether there was anything under Rodleen. There was. A woman who taught school in Ordway and whose grandmother's married name turned up in the garden drawer on an envelope of a melon that no longer exists. A young couple who farmed ground her father had once farmed and did not know it until Ruth showed them the section number in a book from 1952. Otis Dray came out in the last week of August. He walked around the outside of the building once, the way he had in April, and then he came in and asked, in the doorway of the dry room, whether the 1953 book was on the shelf. It was. His father's name was in it, on the 2nd of November, 4 pounds of rye, held for, charge none. He looked at it for a good while. Then, he said that his father had come home from that errand and told the family they would eat, and that he had never in his life said where the seed came from or who cleaned it for nothing, and Otis had been 11 years old and had not asked, and had wondered about it for 73 years. Ruth wrote his name in a notebook of her own that night. It was the first entry she ever made. By the 1st of September, there had been 130 visitors, and the story had run in the city paper, and a man from a seed company had left 2 messages, and Dale Tolliver had heard every word of it. He came out on a Saturday in the 2nd week of September, and he was pleasant about it, which was worse. Dale walked the cleaning floor with his hands in his vest pockets and admired the swept boards and said she had done wonders with the place. He said the family had been talking. He said nobody wanted any unpleasantness. He said he had been reading up. Then he took a photocopy out of his folder. It was a page from a partnership schedule dated the 4th of January, 1978, prepared by Lowell Kinnard, listing the assets of Tolliver Brothers Farms. 21 lines, tractors, a combine, 4 bins, a grain leg, and near the bottom, in typescript, seed house stock and supplies, at cost $4,200.00. Dale explained it in a reasonable voice. The building was Harlan's. Sure, nobody was arguing about the building. But the seed operation had run under the partnership for years. That line was right there in the schedule, which meant the stock in that building was partnership property, and on Harlan's death it went to the surviving partner along with everything else. And his father, being 79 and not well, had asked Dale to look after it. He said it was nothing personal. He said a thing was either on the schedule or it wasn't. Ruth asked him if he had been in the north room. He said he had not, and that he did not need to, and that the fellow from the seed company had been very clear on the phone about what it was likely worth. The fellow from the seed company was named Brant Wiscombe, and he drove out the following Tuesday in a white crew cab with a company decal on the door. He was courteous and about 40, and he did not ask to see the registers, which Ruth noticed, because everyone else who had come out that summer had asked to see the registers before anything. He offered $18,000 for the contents of the room, taken as a lot, hauled by his people, paid on signing. He mentioned, in the same breath, a consulting arrangement for Ruth personally at $2,500, which he described as a courtesy for her time. Ruth asked him what his company would do with it. He said that would depend on evaluation. He said some of it would go into their program. He said the rest would be, and he used this word, consolidated. She told him she would think about it, which was the third time that year she had used that sentence, and the first time she had said it to a man who had no idea she was lying. The papers came on the last day of September. Wendell Tolliver, as surviving partner of Tolliver Brothers Farms, filed for an accounting of partnership assets and asked the court for an order preserving the property in dispute pending resolution. The judge signed it, as judges do, because a preservation order is not a ruling on anything. It is only a way of making sure that nothing walks off while the lawyers argue. A deputy came out on the 2nd of October, apologized twice, put a hasp and a county padlock on the door of the north room, and ran a paper seal across the frame with a case number written on it in ballpoint. For 9 days, Ruth Tolliver lived 11 feet from a room she was not allowed to enter. She did not take it well, and there is no reason to pretend she did. She slept badly. She kept finding herself standing in front of the sealed door with a cup of tea going cold in her hand. Nickel the cat sat in front of it too, because cats sit in front of doors, and Ruth found this unbearable and could not have said why. She walked the fence line twice a day, out to the ditch and back, because moving was better than sitting. It rained on the 4th and 5th of October. Hard, and she lay awake listening to the tin take-it and thinking about a paper seal 11 feet away with a case number on it, and about the fact that the county had put a lock on a door her husband had oiled every week of his adult life. The deputy came back on the 6th to check the seal and apologized again, unprompted, and stood on the cinders afterward for a minute, looking at the building with his hat in his hand, and Ruth thought that he probably had a grandfather in one of those books and did not know it. But the thing that actually frightened her was outside, behind the building, in 11 short rows. Because Harlan had planted the year's grow out in May, before he died, which is to say, he had planted it in April in his head, and Ruth had found the rows in June, and had watered them all summer without fully understanding what they were. 11 lots, planted on the 9th-year rotation, coming up on the only chance they would get for another 9 years. 3 of them were from jars that had tested under 20%. If those rows were not picked in October, those 3 lines were finished. Not lost. Finished. There was no second copy anywhere on earth. She told Junie Barrows this on the phone, and Junie told the lawyer. The lawyer was Corinne Fabry, in the county seat, 44 years old, who had taken the case for a flat fee that Ruth suspected was less than half her time. Lowell Kinnard had declined it in one honest sentence. He had drawn the partnership agreement, and he had typed the 1978 schedule, and he could not be on both sides of his own typing. Fabry went in front of the judge on the 7th of October with an affidavit from Dr. Ochiltree and asked for one narrow thing. Not the room. Not the collection. Permission for the plaintiff's own agent to be present while 11 rows of plants behind the building were harvested, threshed, and returned to the sealed room on the grounds that the property in dispute was alive, and that a preservation order, which preserved paper while allowing seed to die in the field, was not a preservation order at all. Wendell's lawyer objected on principle and lost, which is what happens to objections on principle. They picked the rows on the 11th of October. Ruth, Junie Barrows, Theo Vang, Otis Dre in a lawn chair calling out row numbers, and a deputy standing at the corner of the building with a clipboard, logging every envelope in and out. It took 9 hours. It is possible that no county in that state has ever produced a stranger document than the deputy's inventory from that afternoon. The hearing itself was on the 4th of November in the small courtroom, and it was not supposed to be an event. 68 people came. They came because Della Frayne at the Historical Society had spent 5 weeks doing the only thing that actually mattered, which was reading. In the Society's basement, she had found the Seed House's original receipt books, 6 of them, carbon stubs from 1938 to 1964, each stub signed by a grower. And she had found a handbill, printed in Ordway in 1938 on a job press, 3 inches by 5, which had been folded into the back of the 1938 book and forgotten for 88 years. It read, in full, and Fabry read it aloud twice. Seed left at this house for cleaning and keeping remains the property of the grower or his heirs. No charge is made. Nothing here is for sale. That is a bailment. It is one of the oldest ideas in the law, and it is very simple. Property held by one person for another does not become the holder's, no matter how long he holds it, no matter how well he keeps it, no matter that he dies still holding it. A coat in a cloakroom does not belong to the cloakroom. Every envelope in that room carried a grower's name. 91 books recorded, in a ruled column, that it was held for that grower. 6 receipt books carried the grower's own signatures, and a printed notice stated the terms in language a jury could read in 4 seconds. Kinnard testified, which took courage, and said under oath that the 1978 line for Seed House stock and supplies had been typed by him from a handwritten list in Harlan Tolliver's hand, and he produced that list from his own file, and the list said, burlap sacks, screens, elevator cups, belting, 16 gallons oil. It said nothing about seed. Ruth was on the stand for 11 minutes. Fabry asked her what the collection was worth. She said she did not know, and that she was not the person to ask, and that she had been asked that question by 4 different men that year, and had not liked any of the answers. Then, Fabry asked her what it was, and Ruth had the notebook with her own notebook, the one she had started in August, and she asked the judge if she might read from it. He said she might. She read names, not all of them. She read for perhaps 4 minutes. Kloss, Radlein, Thule, Dre, Brandhorst, Speck, Amundsen, Verplunk, Oaks, a farm, and a township, and a year after each one. The room was quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when people are hearing their own last names. She stopped, and she said that this was what was in the room. Not beans. A list of people who had been told their way of doing things was finished, and who had gone on doing it anyway, and had had the sense to write it down. The judge ruled from the bench on the 18th of November. The building, the machinery, and the 91 registers passed under the will to Ruth Tolliver as the personal property of Harlan Tolliver and never partnership assets. The 1978 schedule line referred to supplies and could not be stretched over the deposits, and the deposits themselves were held in bailment and had never belonged to Harlan Tolliver or to Tolliver Brothers Farms or to anyone's estate at all. They belonged, then and now, to the growers and their heirs. Which meant that Wendell Tolliver had spent $5,000 in fees to establish, in a court of record, that his brother had never owned any of it, and that Brant Wiscombe's $18,000 had been an offer to buy 411 families' property from a woman who had never had the power to sell it. Dale did not come to the ruling. Wendell did not appeal. They have not spoken to her since, and within the year the home quarter was sold to a buyer from out of state, which the county noticed, and about which the county said very little and thought a great deal. The letters went out in January, 411 of them, to farms and to the last known addresses of heirs, and each one said what was being held, and in whose name, and since what year, and asked what the family wished done with it. 19 families asked for their seed back. Ruth cleaned it, weighed it, wrote the envelope out fresh in pencil, and handed it across the counter, and she said afterward that those 19 were the best days of the whole business, because a bean going home is the entire point and always was. 364 families signed the assignment. It was 1 page. It gave their deposit to the Cane Creek Seed Trust to be kept, grown out, and shared, and never sold, with Ruth Tolliver named as keeper and Junie Barrows named to follow her. 28 could not be found at all, and their envelopes stayed in the drawers under their own names, held for, the way they had been since before the war, because that is what held for means. The accessioning took the university 2 years. Every lot that went into the national system went in with the writing attached, and in the public record, for each one there is a field for the collector, and in that field, for hundreds of accessions now, there are the names of people from one flat county who were told for 60 years that they were behind the times. Kloss, Radline, Thule, Dre, Verplank, Oaks, those entries will be there when the building is gone. That is what a register is for. The bean was released 4 years later. It is a navy bean with tolerance to a root rot that had been costing growers real money, and it is in seed catalogs now under the name Cane Creek, and the release notice, which is 2 pages of very dry writing that almost nobody reads, lists the collector of record as Corliss Speck, Cadmus County. Ruth did not frame it. She copied it into the back of the 1970 register in pencil, on the page after her father's last entry, which is where she felt it belonged. Ordway amber went back into the National Repository, and a sample of it went into the deep vault where the world keeps its spare copies, in a mountain, in the cold, and Ruth has a photograph of the box on the wall of the office over the hot plate. The money, since people always ask, was this. A foundation gave $140,000 to endow the building, which bought a roof, a dehumidifier the size of a suitcase that runs 11 days a year, wiring that does not run up the wall on cable staples, and a small stipend for a keeper. The university signed a 5-year evaluation agreement for the grow-out plots. There is a royalty on the bean, and it goes to the trust, not to her, at her instruction and over some argument. She kept the $61,000. She lives on it and on her Social Security, in the office of the seed house, and she is not rich, and when anyone raises the subject, she says she was paid in January of that first year, in a courtroom, when 68 people came and sat down. The Ordway School plants the grow-out rows now, in May, 4 rows a class, with the row cards written in pencil, because that is the rule. The Historical Society put a marker on the road side of the building. The tin is still pond green. Nobody has ever repainted it, and nobody ever will. Otis Dre died 2 winters ago at 86. In the 1953 book, on the 2nd of November, his father's name is still there in a ruled column. 4 pounds of rye, held for, charge none. And now there is a second line beside it in a newer hand recording that his son came in and read it. On a morning in April, Ruth Tolliver opened a new ledger. It was the 92nd. She had ordered it from a bindery that still makes them, tall and narrow, leather corners, marbled edges, and she had numbered the spine herself in white ink. She sat at the office table, with the light coming through the window she had scrubbed with vinegar and newspaper on her first week in that building, and she took a pencil out of a quart jar, and she ruled the columns by hand. Date, grower, farm and township, kind, pounds in, cleaned out, germination, held for, charge. Then she wrote the first line. Ruth Tolliver, Spec Place, Cane Creek, Navy Bean, our own line. 2 pounds. Germ 97. Held for whoever comes. Charge, none. It took her a long time, because she is not a fast writer, and because she had to stop once. The lawyer had been right about the $1,100. The tin is still worth about that. Everything that made it matter was, and remains, worth nothing at all in the only sense he was trained to measure. And that is precisely why it was still there to be found. Nobody steals what has no price. Nobody bothers to burn it. It just sits in a dry room, in the dark, in pencil, waiting for one person to be poor enough and stubborn enough and old enough to sit down on a nail keg and read it. So here is the question, and I would like you to actually answer it in the comments, because the answers on these stories are better than the stories. Who in your family kept something going that nobody ever thanked them for? A skill, a recipe, a plot of ground, a name in a book. Tell me what it was, and tell me their name, and let us put a few more of them on the record where they can be read. And if you believe that the proof somebody mattered is worth more than the money that gets left behind, subscribe and stay with me. There is another ledger, and another widow, and another building nobody wanted, and I will have it for you next week.